Hello, and welcome. Today, I'll be showing you how to use the Operational Impact Estimator, or OIE tool, which is a part of the Total Cost of Stewardship tool suite. By the end of this tutorial, you will have learned how to use the OIE tool for your own work. I'll offer an overview of the tool, and then we'll step through an example scenario from start to finish so that you can better understand the sequence of steps to take and how to approach selecting the data that you'll enter. So, what is the OIE? It is a tool that allows you to lay out institutional staffing and budgetary capacity for collection stewardship activities, and then assess how it work on a specific collection or potential acquisition might impact that capacity. It's designed to help consider both the costs of the work necessary to responsibly care for a collection and the impact to an institution's total annual capacity for collection stewardship work. The OIE is intended to support decision-making and communication across the broad range of stakeholders who are involved in collection acquisition work. The data it generates can also be used to inform conversations with donors, granting agencies, and administrators when discussing the funds necessary for collection stewardship. It allows flexible data input so that estimates can be as broad or specific as is feasible at a given point in the acquisition process. You can use the OIE as a standalone tool, or you can use the data it generates in combination with other resources in the Total Cost of Stewardship tool suite, like the Operational Impact Report and the Acquisition Proposal. The Total Cost of Stewardship tool suite is designed to support the Total Cost of Stewardship framework, a collaborative approach to collection building and stewardship that supports making informed, shared collection building decisions. The OIE supports the second element of the framework, determine stewardship capacity, and can serve to support the third element as well, gather and share information. All of the tools in the suite, as well as the accompanying report, are available at this URL. If you haven't already, the first step to using the Operational Impact Estimator is to download the Excel file and manual. I'll encourage you to download and use the manual as well as the tool itself. You'll likely want to refer back to the manual often as you get used to working with the OIE. Before you can enter data into the OIE, you're going to want to take some time to gather the information that you'll need. The OIE takes information you input and uses it to make a cost and capacity estimate. You will need to gather information about your organizational staffing and budgets and about the collection you wish to assess. If you don't have exact figures for all of these things, you can estimate. The more specific the data you're able to use, the more accurate your estimates will be. For organizational information, you'll need to think about staff types, or the distinct categories and job titles of the positions that work on collection stewardship activities that you wish to include, the salary and hourly pay rate and fringe benefit rates for those positions, an estimation of the percentage of time those positions devote to collection stewardship work, the annual paid time off accruals for salaried and hourly staff, and the annual budget amounts for supplies, transportation, vendor services, and other budget line items that support collection stewardship activities. In addition to organizational data, you will also need data specific to the collection you're addressing, including an evaluation of the work that will be required on the collection, an assessment of which positions will do the required work, and an estimate of how long that work will take. If you need help thinking through how long the required work on the collection might take, you can use our Quick Cost Estimator tool to get a general estimate. Now let's go ahead and open up the Excel file and take a look at the OIE. All right, let's start with a look at the general structure of the OIE. It has 4 numbered tabs, each of which serves a specific purpose. For each tab, you will input information manually into certain fields, which will then feed into other fields containing calculations. The Cost Estimation Tools Manual, starting on page 13, provides full descriptions of each tab, notes on how to approach data input for that tab, an explanation of the calculation logic used in the tab, and detailed guidance about data input for each field in the tool. We'll get into some, but not all, of this detail today. If you ever get lost or stuck using the OIE, referencing the manual should help. The tabs themselves are numbered in sequence of operations. In tab 1, you'll define staffing types and hours. In tab 2, you'll define staffing and budgetary capacity. In tab 3, you'll estimate the hours and costs for working on a specific collection. And in tab 4, the tool brings all the data together to calculate the impact of the work outlined in tab 3 to your institutional capacity for stewardship. I'll also draw your attention to the key at the top right of each page. It explains the color coding of the cells on all of the tabs. Green cells have data pre-populated that are used for calculations. Yellow cells are fields where you should enter data. And gray cells are fields where the tool will generate data based on underlying calculations in the data you enter. In the first tab, Define Staff Types and Hours, you'll detail staff types dedicated to collection stewardship activities and their rate of pay. The OIE then breaks the pay rate down into an hourly rate for all positions to be used in calculations on subsequent tabs. There are 3 types of data that you'll input in this tab. First, data about the workday at your institution. The OIE assumes that all salaried staff are expected to work the same number of hours in a day. If this isn't the case at your institution, generalize by using an average. In reality, we know that some people work a greater or lesser number of hours than expected, but for the sake of simple calculations, the tool assumes all will work the same number of hours in a day. Next, you'll put in information about positions paid using an annual salary in the top section. You'll need to input title, salary, and benefit rate expressed as a percentage of salary. Next, you'll enter data about positions paid using an hourly rate. You'll need to input title, hourly rate, and benefit rate expressed as a percentage of pay. Depending on the size of your institution and goals for using this tool, you may want to take a more generalized or a more specific approach to the data you use about positions and salary. You can choose to define staff types that represent multiple people in similar positions, or to represent all individual staff positions. Because this tool is intended to create informed estimates rather than exact cost calculations, either approach will be effective. We suggest using this section to represent everyone with archives and special collections acquisition and stewardship responsibilities in your organization, so that the impact of any acquisition can be measured against the total available organizational capacity. If all staff with acquisition and stewardship responsibilities are listed, rather than an abbreviated list of those who might work on a specific acquisition, the data here and the capacity information entered into tab 2 can be reused for each new potential acquisition. However, it is flexible enough that you can choose any group, department, or subsection of staff whose work you would like to represent in this tab. You can define up to 10 salaried and 10 hourly staff types. If this isn't sufficient to represent your staff, consider generalizing positions. There are also instructions in the customization section of the manual on how to add more lines here. In the second tab, Define Capacity, you can determine annual staff capacity for collection stewardship work and define annual budgetary capacity for other than personnel spending, or OTPS, for costs such as supplies, transportation, and vendor services. The OIE uses the data entered here to break down time allocated towards stewardship activities into capacity increments for use in calculations in the later tabs. Capacity increments are expressed in hours, days, and months to help you in planning and to support reporting options on subsequent tabs. The tab is broken into 3 sections: salaried positions, hourly positions, and other than personnel spending. There are 4 types of data that you'll enter into this tab. Here, you will put data about paid time off for salaried employees. Though not everyone takes all time off available to them in a year, for the sake of simple calculations, the tool assumes that all employees take all time off allocated to them in the spreadsheet. Here, you'll put data about the number of FTE or full-time equivalents for each staff type. So for the positions you listed in the first tab, here you will tell us how many full-time equivalencies you have for that position. For example, if someone is part-time, 10 hours a week, you can enter 0.25. If you want to generalize and combine individual positions into staff types, you can enter a number larger than 1 here. Here, you'll input data about the amount of time allotted for each staff type toward collection stewardship duties. We know that most staff do not devote all of their working hours to one kind of task. The tool asks for this data to estimate the amount of time staff will have annually to devote to collection stewardship activities, as opposed to reference desk shifts, teaching, attending meetings, and other kinds of work. You will have to decide the scope of work you define as collection stewardship activities for your program. It may include pre-custodial activities, accessioning, cataloging, processing, conservation and preservation work, or digitization-related activities. Data about budget lines for needs other than personnel spending goes in the table at the bottom of the tab. This data is used to quantify budgetary capacity for goods and services necessary to support collection stewardship, such as supplies or vendor services for transportation, digitization, or other activities. You'll need to determine the relevant budget categories you wish to include here, as appropriate to your budget and institution. In the third tab, Estimate Costs and Hours, you will lay out the work that will be required for a collection, who will do that work, and the minimum and maximum amount of time it might take. The tool uses the data that you input here, combined with the data from the first 2 tabs, to determine and then total the number of hours of work required and the salary cost of that work. Total hours and costs of each activity are shown per line, as well as totaled at the top of the tab. We've broken down the table into standard phases of the collection stewardship lifecycle to help you think through the necessary work at each stage. You may follow these phases as a general guide to structuring your estimations. You can also ignore or redefine the phases as is useful to you. For each phase, you will identify the type of work required, select the staff type that will perform that work, and estimate a minimum and maximum number of hours that the work might take. The staff types that you defined in tab 1 will appear in a drop-down menu, and the job title you specified in tab 1 will populate in the job title category. You can take a granular or generalized approach to entering this data, depending on how much information you have and how accurate an estimation you need. At the bottom of the tab is the Other Than Personnel Spending section, where you can estimate other non-staffing costs. The drop-down menu will show default options of supplies and transportation, as well as any user-defined categories you specified in tab 2. If needed, additional lines may be added to the OTPS table by following the steps in the customization section of the manual. The fourth and final tab, Estimate Capacity Impact, uses data entered in the previous tabs to calculate how the activities defined in tab 3 impact total annual operational capacity. You do not need to input any data in this tab, as it draws all of its data from the other tabs. If you've filled out sufficient data in the first 3 tabs, all data will pre-populate here. Capacity impact is displayed per staff type. Total staffing impact across all staff types is displayed at the top of the tab. Impacts to capacity are expressed as both time increments and as a percentage total of annual capacity. Impacts to the OTPS budgets are displayed at the bottom of the tab. You can use this drop-down menu in the top left of the tab to change the time increment in which capacity impact is expressed by selecting hours, days, or months. Now that we've had a tour of the OIE and the way it works, let's walk through an example of filling it out from start to finish. For this example, we'll pretend that we are considering acquiring an archival collection consisting of paper-based archival records, photographs, and some legacy audiovisual materials. Our institution is interested in knowing how much time this will take staff to assess, accession, and process, and would also like a rough estimate of how much it will cost to hire a third-party vendor to digitize the AV materials. Let's start by filling out the first tab, Define Staff Types and Hours. If you remember from earlier in the video, yellow cells are the fields where we need to input data. The first yellow field to fill out is working hours per day. Here, we're going to put 8, which represents that at our institution, a working day on average consists of 8 working hours. Once we've entered a number into working hours per day, total annual working hours per year populates. What this calculation is doing is taking your working hours per day input and multiplying it by working days per year, which the OIE specifies as 260. Don't worry about vacation and other time off yet. We'll account for that later. Let's move on to inputting staff details next. Here, we will fill out the yellow fields in the salaried and hourly staff tables with job titles, pay rates, and benefit percentage rates for each. Since I would like to use the OIE for all potential acquisitions, I'm going to go ahead and represent all of the positions in my institution that work on collection stewardship activities: curators, catalogers, archivists, conservators, digitization staff, and since I'm at an academic institution, student assistants. Not all of these people will work on this specific collection, but this lets me save and reuse the data for every new acquisition I might want to consider. Some of these positions are paid an annual salary, and some of them are paid on an hourly basis, so I'll enter in each position in the appropriate section. You'll see that I've entered the job titles for each of the staff I want to represent across both the salaried and the hourly sections of the tab. Now I'll enter their annual salaries and hourly rates of pay. Lastly, we'll enter in benefit rates expressed as a percentage for each. You input benefit rate for each position, so if you have different benefit rates for different types of staff, you'll be able to represent it here. Note that once each of these fields are filled out for each staff type, the OIE auto-calculates the total cost per hour per staff member based on the number you've input. If you want to know more about how the OIE is auto-calculating these rates, you can either click into one of the gray cells to peek into the formula, or you can look the fields up in the manual. Now that we've defined all staff types working on this collection, let's move on to the second tab, Define Capacity. First, we'll start by filling out paid holidays here. We will say that our institution has 10 standard paid holidays that all staff get throughout the year. Next to that field, we have to fill out other paid time off in days. This represents the cumulative total of paid annual leave, so vacation as well as sick or personal days. Obviously, in some instances, this may vary from one staff to another, so we would suggest that you input an average here. In our case, we're going to say that each staff gets an average of 15 annual leave days plus 10 sick days, resulting in 25 total paid time off days. So I'll enter 25 here. Notice that the total active workdays field has now updated from 260 to 225. So of the 260 working days, assuming staff take all paid holidays, annual leave, and sick days off, we are left with a total of 225 actual working days for calculation purposes. Next, for each salaried staff type we entered, we will input their full-time equivalency, or FTE number, as well as a percentage representing how much of their job they actually devote to collection work. Note that the staff types we defined in the first tab have conveniently auto-populated here, so we don't need to re-enter them. First, I'll go through and put in FTE numbers for salaried staff. Some of these positions are part-time, some are full-time, and for a few, we have more than one person in that position, so I'll reflect that here. For all the full-time positions, I'll put 1 for FTE, which represents that they are full-time. We have 2 processing archivist positions, so I'm going to put a 2 here. We also have 1 archivist who is working on a grant for a term that will end 9 months into the year. So I'm going to put 0.75 for them, Even though they're working full-time, in terms of their annual capacity, we only have them for 3/4 of the year. Once FTE is entered, the OIE then calculates each staff's annual working days and hours based on the total active working days in a year multiplied by the FTE. You can notice how the grant archivist at 0.75 has fewer hours than the full-time staff. Next, I'll work on specifying the capacity for staff paid by the hour. For these positions, I'll specify the hours they work per week. Next, I'll specify the number of weeks they work per year. Note here that the holiday and paid time off information you input above only applies to the salaried positions. So if hourly workers get paid time off, you'll want to account for that in your week count. For example, our AV specialist works full-time, so they get 10 holidays, 10 sick days, and 15 vacation days. So I'll subtract 7 weeks from the 52-week total in a year and put 45. And I'll do the same for our digitization specialist. Since our student workers usually leave for 12 weeks in the summer and 4 weeks in the winter, I'll put 36 here and here. Next, we'll specify what percentage of time each staff member allocates toward actually working on collections. What do we mean by this? This percentage takes into account the reality that most staff have varying responsibilities and probably aren't spending 100% of their time doing collections stewardship work. For example, our processing archivists also have reference desk shifts each week and have to attend staff meetings and serve on committees, so I'll say that 80% of their time is spent on processing and other stewardship activities. And I'll go through and fill out similar percentage times for each of the positions. And then I'll scroll down and do the same for the hourly positions. You'll notice that, again, our total capacity hours and total annual capacity in days and months has changed to include the information about the percentage of time spent devoted to collections. Lastly, within this capacity tab, we'll define our annual budgets for both supplies and services in the other than personnel spending table. Here, we'll say we have $25,000 a year to spend on supplies and $15,000 a year to spend on transportation. And we have vendor budgets for both conservation treatments and digitization services of $30,000 each. So I will add those categories to the description. And then I'll add $30,000 to each budget line. The OIE will now take this capacity information into account in defining each staff member's capacity and your budgetary capacity throughout the working year. We'll see this more clearly defined in the final capacity tab. But for now, let's move on to the third tab, Estimate Costs and Hours. The Estimate Costs and Hours tab is where we'll start to see some actual estimates for costs in dollars as well as in hours. These grand totals are at 0 for now, but will automatically update as we fill out the tab. So here we're laying out how much time the staff types we defined in the first tab will be spending across different phases of this particular acquisition's life cycle, from the point at which it is being considered by the institution to when it's ultimately acquired, and all of the things that happen to it after that. The OIE suggests phases here, but you could certainly go in and customize these headers if they don't quite match how things work at your institution. Under pre-acquisition, we are going to plan for the curator and accessioning archivist to go out and perform a site visit at the donor storage space. So under pre-acquisition activity, we will type in site assessment. Next to each, we'll click on the drop-down arrow to select the staff that are going to do this activity. Notice how all of the staff we defined in the first two tabs appear here in the list. So I'm going to select accessioning archivist and then curator. Next, we'll define what we expect to be the minimum and maximum hours they will spend performing the site assessment. So here we'll enter in 4 for a minimum number of hours and 8 for a maximum. We're essentially saying that we think the site visit will take between a half to a full workday. Notice how the OIE has calculated a subtotal cost for each staff type for these activities, as well as updated the grand totals at the top of the page. Next, let's fill out details for how much time it will take to accession and process this collection. We know that if we acquire it, the accessioning archivist will accession the collection. So we'll put accessioning in the activity, select accessioning archivist, and we think it will take 1 to 2 full days to accession. So I'll put 8 for minimum hours and 16 for maximum hours. And then we know that the processing archivist will process the collection. So I'll put processing as an activity, select the processing archivist. And for minimum and maximum hours, we think this will take roughly 2 weeks to a month to process. So I'm going to put 80 hours in for minimum and 160 hours in for maximum. And I know that the graduate student worker is going to assist with processing the collection, so I'll add them to the processing activities as well. Hourly workers are represented after all of the possible types of salaried staff in the dropdown, so you'll have to scroll all the way down to hourly staff types to get the graduate student worker. They only work part-time, so I will put in 40 to 80 hours to represent their work on the collection. Lastly, we know that because part of this collection comprises audiovisual materials, the audiovisual specialist will need to dedicate some time to creating item-level cataloging. So that will take them approximately 1 to 2 weeks. So again, I'll scroll down to select them from the hourly staff menu and put in the hours for 1 to 2 weeks of their work. Moving on to post-acquisition treatments, this has to do with activities that happen to the collection after we've finished processing. So we know that we don't have in-house capacity to do the digitization work on the AV materials, and so we'll be sending it out to a vendor, which means our audiovisual specialist will need to prep and pack the materials to go out to the vendor and then check them back in and do QC work on the digital files once they're returned. So I'll put digitization, prep, and QC here. Select the audiovisual specialist from the drop-down menu. And we think this will be about a week to a week and a half worth of work, so we'll enter 40 to 60 hours here. We have a section at the bottom called Other Activities that you can use in the exact same way as the ones above to specify things that might not fall into these phases. The last section on this tab is Other than Personnel Spending, which covers expenses that don't involve staff hours. So here we're going to record a supplies cost. In this example, we think that the supplies will cost between $1,500 and $2,000 to rehouse this collection into appropriate housing. And we'll need to pick the collection up from the donor, which will cost between $200 and $350. And lastly, we know that if we acquire it, we'll need to arrange sending the AV portion of the collection out to the vendor to digitize. So under our digitization vendor line, we're going to put between $5,000 and $8,000 for digitization costs, which is really just a ballpark estimate, our best guess based on our past experience. And now we're done filling out this tab. Let's scroll up to see where our grand totals are in terms of costs and hours. So this acquisition will take between 216 and 412 labor hours to work on. And in terms of salary and budget, cost anywhere between $14,734 and $25,676. You can also see the costs broken down per activity. So we're satisfied with these estimates. Let's move on to the fourth and final tab, Estimate Capacity Impact. Unlike the 3 tabs we just covered, Estimate Capacity Impact does not require any data entry. All of the information here is based on all of the data that we've already entered. This tab basically takes what we input about staffing and budgets and then compares it to what was specified that we needed for this particular collection. And then it reports on the capacity impact that collection would have. So it reports total impact at the top of the tab, and then it reports staffing impact with salaried staffing impact at the top of the staffing table and hourly staffing impact toward the bottom of the staffing table. And then at the bottom of the tab, it reports impact to the OTPS budget. The one thing that you can change on this tab is the unit of time the tab reports capacity in. So if you click on the drop-down menu, you'll see that you have options for hours, days, and months. When you select one of these options, the tab changes the way that it reports capacity impact. So right now it's on hours. I'm going to go ahead and change it to days. And you'll see that this collection would impact our annual capacity for stewardship by taking up between 1.5% and a little bit shy of 3% of our total capacity for the year. These total capacity numbers can be a little bit deceiving, and it's important to look at them in combination with the capacity impact for individual positions. So, for instance, though this collection would take up between 1.5% and 3% of our total impact, if we look at the processing archivist line, it would take up between roughly 3 and 5.5% of our processing capacity for the year. Similarly, if we scroll down and look at the audiovisual specialist, it would take up between 5.5% and a little bit less than 10% of their capacity for the year. Similarly, it would have a significant impact on our digitization budget for the year, taking up between roughly 16 to 26% of our capacity to do vendor digitization for the year. So now we've filled out the OIE from top to bottom, and you can see how to use it and how it can show you the total cost and capacity impact for a potential acquisition. You can use this information to have conversations with your colleagues and to make informed acquisition decisions together. This concludes our tutorial for the Operational Impact Estimator. Thanks so much for watching. We hope you'll use the OIE and encourage you to check out the other resources in the Total Cost of Stewardship tool suite. Thank you.